I am the Landscape Conservation Section Manager in the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I am our agency's alternate on the Washington Shrubsteppe Restoration and Resiliency Initiative Steering Committee. And we want to welcome you to the training that we're providing this afternoon. It is being recorded. We've had a tremendous amount of interest in this, but I know that not everybody was available to attend this afternoon. So we are going to record, and then I am going to provide that recording to our web folks to have it posted online, and I'll share that recording with all of you, as well as the folks that expressed interest that weren't able to make it. So as you're joining, we've asked you to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, affiliation, and participation in WSRRI if you participated over the last three years in the development of the initiative and the long-term strategy. Go ahead, Andrew. I'm going to do a quick agenda review here, and then I'm going to give the most basic of WSRRI overview, and then I'm going to kind of use that opportunity to kind of lead into the purpose of the training that we've developed. Andrew is going to actually walk you through the spatial priorities. He's got quite a few slides that kind of demonstrate how they were developed, and then he'll kind of demonstrate the utility of the tool. We're going to have some breakout groups that Sonia is going to set up, and then we're going to go through this breakout group exercise where we're going to ask you to walk through certain scenarios using the data provided in the TerraDAP tool. There is no right answer. We did this as a small group earlier, and it's really just informative and interesting to hear people kind of think through decision making given the information provided in the tool, as well as the other information that might not be there that would be helpful. So we're looking for a pretty rich discussion in those small groups on how can you use the information provided in the spatial priorities in the TerraDAP tool generally to inform different decisions. We're going to ask some of you to share a brief report out on your small group discussion, and then we'll wrap up just before 4. Go ahead, Andrew. Okay, so I think many of you are aware of WSRRI. That's the Washington Shrubsteppe Restoration and Resiliency Initiative. This is a very large collaborative effort that was born out of really a legislative proviso that was developed in response to the 2020 fires that burned in eastern Washington. Within about a 24-hour period, we lost somewhere between 400 and 600,000 acres of wildlife habitat, rural communities due to wildfires that burned on Labor Day. The collaborative effort is focused around conserving and restoring wildlife habitats, enhancing wildfire preparedness and response, and supporting working lands. We really kind of rallied together as a partnership that was led by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Natural Resources, and the Washington State Conservation Commission to put us collectively in a better place in the future than we were when the fires burned in 2020. So collectively, we're looking to do all of those things. We want to be better prepared when wildfires occur. We want to basically get a jump on them. We want to be able to do pre-fire treatments to make the landscape more resilient. We want to support our working lands. We've done that through multiple projects such as deferred grazing and wildlife-friendly fencing. And ultimately, the primary aim is to do all of that to conserve and restore wildlife habitats. We just released our long-term strategy in March 2024. It's available on the WDFW WSRRI webpage. I describe it as 126 pages of solid gold. I highly recommend that if you haven't been able to yet, that you try to find the opportunity to review it. It was a large partner-driven process to really identify actions for long-term conservation and recovery of shrubsteppe habitats, wildlife, and communities. And those, the duration is 30 years, but the actions are organized into those 5 primary categories there. So community engagement, habitat protection, habitat restoration, species management, and wildland fire management. Go ahead, Andrew. The way that the strategy prioritizes those actions is around the spatial priorities that you're going to learn more about today. We basically, working with TerraDapt, we were able to kind of tier off of what is called the range-wide sagebrush conservation design. It's a west-wide USGS and US Fish and Wildlife Service product that looks at core habitat being kind of the highest quality across the landscape. And the mantra really is defend the core and grow the core. So in WSRRI's approach to prioritizing where we pursue different actions and invest the funding that is associated with WSRRI, we want to defend those high quality core habitats from encroachment of threats, such as further invasion by cheatgrass. We want to defend high quality core habitat from catastrophic wildfire. We want to grow the core by taking action adjacent to cores so that we can actually create more high quality habitat. And then what we did with WSRRI that range-wide product does not do is actually address connectivity. So our approach includes connecting the core. We're looking to maintain open and viable linkages between high quality core areas. Go ahead, Andrew. I do want to state at the front that there are other data sets that are available to inform decision making. This is not, I think Vincent put it, the one tool to rule them all. There are other data sets available, and depending on the decision making that you're doing, you're going to want to really think through the data sets that might inform your decision making and make sure that you're bringing the right tools to the decision at hand. The other data sets that are available include some older Arid Lands Initiative and older Wildlife Habitat Connectivity Working Group data. I think those data sets are from like 2012, 2014. There's the range-wide sagebrush conservation design that I mentioned. We collectively as stakeholders and partners informed the least conflict solar siting process that was managed through Washington State University. That product is available online. In addition, we have our priority habitats and species data sets, and specifically there's some newer data sets there, including Shrubsteppe and biodiversity areas and corridors. And there's a relationship between those and what is in TerraDapt, and we are working with the PHS section to make sure that moving forward, like what that relationship is clear. We want to make sure that all of our partners and user groups understand the content of these data sets and when they are appropriate to use and maybe when they are not, and what decisions they can inform. In addition, coming, not yet available, but coming is the Washington Habitat Connectivity Action Plan. That's a planning process that is, it's in process now, and that action plan will actually integrate the information that WSRRI developed as part of kind of an amalgam of different spatial products that reflect connectivity and important areas. Sonia is going to drop a link in the chat that will provide a really brief kind of summary comparison of these data sets. What we're doing today, though, focuses on the WSRRI spatial priorities and the tool that we've created. Go ahead, Andrew. So today's training, I want to reiterate my appreciation to all of you, but first to the spatial priority team. You're going to see a list of the names at the end. But we've got the TerraDAP team with Andrew and Sonia, Vincent Janssen from WDFW, and Danielle Husband from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They've been really like instrumental in both leading the spatial priority work, which has been very collaborative, and helping to prepare this training. I also want to thank all of you. I was kind of stunned. We had almost 50 people express interest in this training. This is not the only opportunity that you'll have, but I was really just pleased to see not only the amount of interest, but the breadth across different partners. We've got state and federal agencies, we've got conservation districts, we've got consultants, we've got nonprofit partners, and we're really thrilled that you're all interested in this, and we're happy to have you join us in this conversation today. The learning objectives include understanding the types of decisions that could be informed by WSRRI's data, understand how the spatial priorities were developed and how they can inform those decisions. At multiple scales, really the spatial priorities are at an eco-regional scale, but there's information in TerraDAP that can inform finer scale decision-making. We want to help you to access and use the TerraDAP tool appropriately. And, go ahead, Andrew, a couple additional things that we're looking for is your feedback on how we can improve it. When you see the tool, you're gonna, once you poke around it enough, you'll realize that addition of some data would be helpful, or maybe the color scheme is difficult to see. I've worried a little bit about vision impaired, or I guess specifically red-green colorblind individuals, and how they can actually see some of this information. And then we want to get your feedback on the functionality. I think that the way that Andrew and his team have set up the tool, there's a lot of like really cool things that you can kind of toggle on and off. You can look like back and forward in time, but I think that there will be opportunities that you all can help us see to actually make it function a little bit better for future use. I'm going to leave it there. Andrew, are you ready? Oh, Sonia, my bad.
It actually comes to me. Thank you. So what we wanted to do to sort of get the conversation started is hear from all of you on what kinds of decisions do you make in your day-to-day job that you are hoping that a platform like TerraDAP and the data sets that are part of TerraDAP could inform. And so I'm going to put a second link in the chat to what's called an idea board, and essentially think of it as a whiteboard where you guys are going to put sticky notes with your answers to this question. What decisions are you looking to inform with these data sets? And so, Andrew, next slide, please. When I put the link, you go to that link, it will open a page that looks like this. Next slide, please. If you click on that plus sign there, it will open up a sticky note that you can directly type in your answer to that question of what decisions could be guided by the WSRRI spatial priorities. And if you click on that sticky note, once somebody else puts a sticky note up, if you click on that one, next slide, Andrew, it will open up. It would allow you to edit. We ask that you don't edit somebody else's comment. You can add another sticky note with your own thoughts, but it does allow you to upvote. So next slide. So if you see a sticky note that you're like, yes, that's exactly right, and I don't need to type it again, you just click on the note and click on that thumbs up sign, and it will count as an additional copy if you like. So let me put the link in the chat for you guys. So please go to the ideas board and start putting in your answers to that question. What decisions are you looking to inform using the WSRRI spatial priorities? And we'll give everyone a few minutes to think about that and start adding your ideas there. Looks like a number of you have been using the upvote function. So there's a good number of sticky notes that have multiple people adding their vote for those, which is great. If you finished with putting on sticky notes yourself, just make sure that you're reading what others are contributing, adding your votes if it makes sense. But even if it's not, just understanding the spectrum of decisions that people are thinking about. We'll give it another couple of minutes and then we'll open it up for just thoughts or comments that you all have on this board of decisions that you've put together. Okay, so please continue to add sticky notes to the board if you have others that you want to add. But I want to open it up and hear thoughts from anyone who's interested in volunteering. Just unmute yourself and speak up on any thoughts in terms of patterns that you're seeing in the decisions that are included on this board, or things that you see might be missing, or clarification or further detail on the sticky note that you added. Do I have a volunteer? No volunteers. We're going to have to work on that. One of the things that I saw immediately, and maybe it's because we've been having discussions around this, is that, you know, there are some decisions like this first one that got a number of upvotes of where restoration should be conducted given limited resources, that really are looking at, you know, the whole of Eastern Washington Shrubsteppe and looking to inform, where do you narrow in when you have limited resources. And then there are others that are very project specific, of within a particular landscape that I'm working in, where to focus funding for restoration projects, for example. And that could be, I'm looking at the whole of Eastern Washington. It could be, I'm looking at the county that I work in, or the conservation district boundaries that I focus on. It could be, these are decisions that could occur at different scales, but really comes down to identifying places on the landscape. Anyone else have thoughts or comments on this board of decisions we have?
Sonia, one thing I saw, to your point of what's missing, or what kind of surprised me that wasn't up there, was, prescribed fire or aspects of kind of fire planning. So maybe that also speaks to, who's in the group today. But that was just something I noticed, that I looked at most of them and I didn't see fire written anywhere. So yeah, that was one thing that jumped out to me.
I think
there we
there's
go.
a fire one.
Okay, they're right in the center. All right. So that's good. We got fire represented.
Now, but that's a good point. Are there other sort of big categories of decisions that you're either, oh, look, there's a lot of discussion around these types of, or a lot of stickies relating to this type of decision, or something that's missing? Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I think it kind of partners off of what you said, Sonia, is, and I remember quite a few of us groups when we're working on the spatial priorities, like, well, wait a minute, we're down to like everything's important, but really going back to, if everything's important, then nothing is. So it does help to kind of, like, the really high priority stuff, kind of raise it up, of like, whether land management, or let's say we have a mitigation opportunity, like, where does that driven to? So I see that captured in several comments here. So maybe it's kind of a bigger lump, but kind of in the larger land management, like where is, like, the highest priorities. And so, and kind of where, if we have to pool our resources and look at certain areas, where is some of those resources maybe best suited to, is kind of where my eyes go to when we see these maps. So yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. Harriet.
Yeah, I will confess I'm very peripheral to the WSRRI process, so mainly just here to learn. But one thing that I'm particularly interested in sort of taking away from this is some of sort of the underlying methodology about monitoring places through time, and understanding how, like, the grow the core, expand the core, connect the core, that those priorities can change through time, given like permanent land use decisions versus more temporary, right, successional changes in the landscape, and how we're planning on tracking that, and then also communicating those changes in priorities through time. So there seem to be sort of a few like connections to that sort of train of thought through the GMA SMA comment, and then also just some general ones about monitoring.
Yes, that's the dynamic nature of the TerraDAP tool is a key element that hopefully by the end of today, everyone will be familiar with how to look at some of the information that's there that makes it dynamic. Any other thoughts or comments before I hand it back over to Andrew to give you what you came to get, and a flavor for the WSRRI and the TerraDAP tool? Not hearing any, I will hand it over to you, Andrew.
All right, good stuff. Yeah, thanks for joining everybody today. This is great to get this good attendance. I think one of the key starting points for this WSRRI spatial priorities is that priorities aren't just like an inherent property of the landscape, right? You can't just look at a map and say, oh, there's the priorities, right? There's a value system at play here. And the values that the WSRRI initiative really mapped the spatial priorities around were these 3 conservation targets. So we had 1 species of interest, the greater sage grouse, and then we had 2 ecosystems, which are kind of a broader, more holistic look at the landscape. We kind of thought of the whole shrub steppe and divided it into the dry, like xeric side, think sagebrush and grasses, and then the more mesic side, the wetlands, the riparian areas, really any of the moist environments. So it could just be even like a seasonal, like depressional wetland. So 2 ecosystems and 1 species. Remember, this is year 1 of potentially years of work ahead, right? So we couldn't map all the possible targets you could imagine. I'm sure there's lots of species you might want to prioritize around. In a way, these ecosystems were meant to be catch-alls for groups of related species tied to these habitat types and kind of at least crudely represent them. So keep in mind, this is year 1 of potentially a lot more work ahead. And everything we're doing is really valuing these parts of these perspectives of the landscape. And ta-da, we have spatial priorities for each of these targets. So that's a key thing to realize, is that there's not 1 single set of priorities. There's actually 3 sets of priorities, and they really map really differently. You would hope for that, right? They're the dry and the wet sides of the shrub steppe ecosystem are really different systems in different places. There's some overlap, of course, but they're produce really different patterns. And then the sage grouse priorities are really kind of nested within. It's kind of a finer subset of the dry shrub steppe. I could tell you a lot all day about the methods and process that went into this. I'm not going to do that, but I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. I think we'll maybe have a little time for Q&A. Reach out to me if you're interested in details. There is a manual that we can put the link to the chat in the chat if you're interested in going to the manual for this sort of things. But at a high level, these spatial priorities were derived not from like people in crayons drawing circles on maps. It is a data-driven process. We started with base data on the landscape, things like climate and topography and hydrology, transportation and energy infrastructure, and a lot of remote sensing data. And from those like base environmental data sets, we produced a land cover model and a human footprint model, a vegetation model. These are the types of things that served as inputs into the spatial priorities. So for each of these 3 targets, 2 ecosystems and sage grouse, we use these base data sets to map the integrity or the quality of the habitat for the target and the resistance to movement for the target. So think of like, how are sage grouse going to disperse across the landscape, or how are the dry or wet ecosystem species going to move through the landscape. We had a resistance model that kind of quantified rates of movement. And then if you know sort of habitat selection and movement, you can map core areas, which are these local concentrations of highly connected habitat. And you can map corridors between the cores. These are the least costly routes through the landscape that would connect these core areas together. And those things, cores, growth opportunity areas, and corridors, are the priorities that you'll see on the map. And a key thing here is that, so my organization, Terradapt, this is kind of our specialty. Rather than do this as like a manual exercise to produce all these data sets and models in this very labor-intensive clickfest that is like a one-off exercise, we programmatically automated all of these modeling steps, even the production of the input models like land cover and rangeland vegetation. We automated that workflow in the Google Cloud using Google Earth Engine. And that means when we want to update these, we can just run this on a schedule. We get new satellite data coming in, we get new information on the landscape. We can trigger these products to update. And so we always have current information or relatively current information. We can also run them retrospectively back in time, right? So we have historical imagery from Landsat and other satellites and other historical data sets. So we can run these models back in time. And the spatial priorities that we've mapped today are actually an aggregation of the last 5 or 10 years of spatial priorities. So we're already kind of looking at a little temporal window to map the priorities that you'll see today. For each of the 3 targets, we have these types of priorities. I already mentioned this, I think Janet did too earlier: cores, growth opportunity areas, and corridors. But the meaning of these is a little bit different depending on the target. So the cores for all 3 are at a high level. They're just the best of what's left. The best sage-grouse habitat, the best dry and mesic ecosystem habitat. But sage-grouse habitat is a little different. Has a little different. It's an empirical habitat model trained on thousands of sage-grouse locations in eastern Washington. The xeric ecosystem cores is more focused on where is the native shrub steppe vegetation that has the least human footprint and the least amount of invasive annual grasses. Those are the core areas. And then the mesic ecosystem is really focused on, where are those wetlands and riparian areas and wet meadows? And this is an important caveat here. The mesic ecosystem also includes some upland habitat around those wetlands, right? So it's those local connections to upland habitat as well are included in those cores. Growth opportunity areas you can think of as kind of the next level of quality. They're not as good as the cores, but there's something there to work with. There's some native habitat that you could maybe restore and grow the core, right? So that's the idea behind these growth opportunity areas. If you restore them a little bit, improve their condition, you can grow the core. And then lastly, these corridors are connections between the cores and growth opportunity areas. So trying to link these places into a larger network that's connected across this whole region. There are some important caveats to keep in mind as you look at these spatial priorities. So this is an example right here, the red areas. So this is for sage grouse. The red area is the core, the orange is the growth opportunity area, and all this kind of purple shading in between are corridors linking these areas. I've kind of zoomed in to give you this kind of fine scale view because it's important to know that not all the habitat within the core areas is good. It's not all in good condition. If you look closely, this is a sage grouse core. There's wheat fields in here, right? Sage grouse actually use wheat fields a little bit. Ask Mike and Tommy if to back me up on that, but it's not all good habitat. And so if you're thinking about restoration, you shouldn't ignore the cores. You shouldn't just assume the cores are in good condition. You should look into those cores and see what can still be improved. And actually those I would think should be the priorities. The core area is the best of what's left. If we can restore habitat in those and make them even better, that's going to make that core function all the better. I said this a minute ago, the cores and the growth opportunity areas represent kind of the kind of recent 5 or 10 years, depending on the species or ecosystem. So it's kind of the average, or actually it's kind of the mode of the priorities for each of the last 5 or 10 years. It's looking at the aggregate behavior across time. And so if it's a core now, in 2024, it doesn't mean it's actually all functional. It might have burned in the last year. So it might only be recently valuable, but it burned. And so now it's in the state where it might naturally regenerate, or it might need restoration to bring it back up to good condition. So there is a temporal dimension to these to these priority areas that you shouldn't ignore. It's very important. The yellow stuff, it's kind of hard to see on this one. It kind of looks like the orange, but the yellow areas in these priorities are other shrub step areas. So these didn't make the criteria to be in growth opportunity or core areas or corridors, but they're still in some kind of a native condition. Maybe they have a lot of invasive species. Maybe they're just small patches. Maybe they're way on the periphery, but they're still serving a functional role in the landscape, right? We've lost so much shrub step. We don't want to lose these other areas either. So it's important to remember that these other habitats in all of these priority maps are not unimportant. In fact, locally, they can be really important. Another really important thing to remember is that these spatial priority models and the data that forms them, it's a lot of remote sensing data, they're models. Models have error, right? And so the whole point of this exercise is to draw your attention to places in the landscape where we think something might be going on. There might be really good habitat worth protecting. There might be some disturbances that you should really focus your restoration on, but they're candidates, and you should absolutely ground truth every insight you think you get from these data products in the platform, right? So it draws your attention to a place in the landscape, but of course you've got to walk the ground and know the landscape and do the local assessment as well. And lastly, Janet said this also, but I just want to reiterate, there's other valuable priorities out there, other data sets out there that aren't in our platform. I view this as really complementary to all of, not to replace, but to complement existing data sets and priorities out there. So don't lose sight of all the other great work that's out there and is useful. Okay. This is I think a key concept around these spatial priorities is that there's a scale issue here. On the one hand, at the broadest scale, think across the whole Columbia Basin. I think there's applications of these spatial priorities at that scale where maybe you're a land manager, at DFW or DNR, or some big agency that has many properties across this landscape and has to decide where to allocate resources among many competing alternatives, right? So at that scale, you might be asking questions about, what is the kind of the distribution of the best habitat, and where should I invest my protection dollars across this broader network? Maybe I want to focus on the best cores in the best condition, the most central cores. Maybe there's a plan to kind of create new habitat in a new area, and maybe you want to grow smaller cores. There's lots of questions that can be asked at this scale that are really focused on choosing among or between priority areas. But then at the local scale, and at the end of the day, really all conservation is local, right? At some point, you take action in a local place. There's also finer scale decisions for where to site those actions, right? I mentioned before, even within these core areas, it's not all great habitat. So protecting the remaining habitat, you're going to want to drill in to where the habitat is predicted to be. You're going to want to walk the ground and verify that. There's finer scale decisions as well. And so, everybody's coming at this a little differently. One way to think about this, to use these spatial data products in your decision making, is first, I mentioned the 3 values: sage-grouse, xeric, and mesic ecosystems. Those are perspectives on the landscape. It might help to identify what's the thing you're valuing and making a decision around as a starting point. That kind of helps narrow down the decision space. You might ask the question of, well, okay, so maybe I've picked, sage-grouse. Where are the impacts occurring, right, that have affected sage-grouse habitat recently? If you're, maybe you want to do some restoration, you want to know where those impacts are. Maybe you're thinking about the future. Where are the biggest threats emerging on the landscape? Maybe you're trying to protect against those future threats. All of these questions can kind of help orient you on different parts of the data sets and the priorities to help you inform decision making. Understanding what actions are available, if you're interested in restoration or specific types of restoration, that might guide you towards certain data sets. And then lastly, it's really about once you have that kind of decision space narrowed down to a couple options, then it's like what are the priority areas to take action. All right, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the map interface, the tool itself online. Before I do that, I want you to think about the types of data that you see that I show you, and realize that there are lots of data sets or features on this portal that you may want that just aren't there. This is version 1.0. There's a lot more we could do with this. But I'm going to just frame what you see in a few terms, and then it would be really helpful feedback if you could describe needs that are unmet using these kind of same terms. So there's gridded data, there's raster grids. These are kind of a pixely representation of the landscape. This is elevation, I think, in this map. This is kind of all the shades of gray of, habitat quality or connectivity. But you can also have data summarized by these regions, these polygons. You could look at the average habitat quality in different management units. And it's kind of a nice to summarize data by polygons is kind of a nice at a glance way to see the whole landscape in a simpler way. So that sort of, those sorts of representations really aren't featured on our map very well right now, but they could be. So keep that in mind. There's also the metrics, like what are we actually showing you? Most of the data in the map right now is the status of the landscape at any one year in time. So it could be the quality of habitat for the mesic ecosystem in 2022. It could be the fractional cover of invasive annual grasses in a certain year of interest. It's this kind of snapshot in time. What you don't see in this map, though, that I think could be useful is the change between 2 years, right? We started, in 1984 with this much sage grouse habitat. How much have we lost spatially? Where have been the biggest impacts? That's really not featured now, but it could be. So keep that in mind. And then kind of along those lines, there's also the trend, right? Depending on which 2 years you pick for change, you can get different answers. But the overall trend across that whole time series for any one of the layers that you see could also be really useful information. So if you think about reporting data at the pixel level and the polygon level, and you think about it, metrics calculated as kind of status change or trends, I think that's a rich suite of products that can help drive decision making. I want to wrap this up by kind of using these terms and thinking about a couple examples. I have one more thing about the data you're going to see, and that's really if you kind of zoom out to the whole region and look at the pattern of spatial priorities. There's sort of another level of understanding that emerges when you just zoom out and look at it at this big picture. One is like, okay, these are all the red areas here are labeled as core. But are they all equally valuable? Some are bigger than others, right? Do you want to prioritize the big ones or the little ones? You could think about not all the habitat quality within these cores is equal. So there's metrics around the patches themselves, I think, could help you prioritize among the cores. And also think about this as a network of connected habitats, right? So you've got these cores and growth opportunity areas connected by these purple corridors. If you were to lose a couple of these patches, it would really fragment this network. They're kind of highly central. And so think about these centrality concepts too as you use these products. I think it's valuable to look at the regional scale and see where certain cores and corridors lie within this network and how important they are to keeping it connected. Okay, let's take a look at this map portal. I think the link's in the chat. If it isn't, we can put it in there. Please don't go to it just yet, though. I'm just going to walk you through it. I mean, I'm sure, I'm guessing you've all visited already, but a quick overview. There's at the top bar here are a lot of settings and features. These are clickable, so you can monitor the environment. And that's really looking at the past, 4 decades of the changing landscape. It's the historical data, mostly the status of the landscape. You can project into the future. Really, this is kind of a work in progress. It's not really, it's more of a future vision for what we could add to this initiative. So we're not really going to focus on the future projections. And then there's prioritize. So these are the spatial priorities for the 3 targets. Here's the greater sage grouse. So for each one of these, you pick a theme. Let's go to the ecosystems, and now we can pick among the xeric or the mesic, and then you click on the layer of interest, the spatial priorities. Once you've picked a data set, or even before, you can change the base layer. So there's satellite and terrain and road maps and this kind of hybrid that has labels and imagery. And you can use this opacity slider to whatever layer you have selected. You can just kind of have it, the opacity change relative to the base map. And there's this time slider that if there's data sets that span multiple years, you can slide this to look at the change over time. The priorities, we only have it for the year. We finished these last year, so it's 2023 only. But if you go back to monitor and look at the landscape and say, let's look at in perennial grass cover. And let's get this opacity up here. It takes a while for these data sets to render. This is 40 years of like 30-meter data to render, so it'll take a little while for it to all render and look good. But you can grab this slider and just walk backwards in time and look at the shifting pattern of any of these monitoring layers. And you can zoom in. There's a zoom in and out. You can use your mouse wheel. You can hit Control and your left mouse button and change the angle and look around in 3D, and just really explore this landscape. And then lastly, on this overlay section, there's these are just polygons that can be useful to orient you. So there's watersheds. Let's turn off this layer. These pink boundaries are like 10 watersheds in the region. There's counties and there's counties. There's also the spatial priorities for each of the targets. So there's sage grouse cores, growth opportunity areas, and corridors. It's kind of hard to see these, especially when some of the cores have holes in them. So it's really, I think, challenging to orient. If you also go into the species, what are we on, sage grouse, and look at, it's also an option to add it as an image here under the priorities. So you can see it as an overlay and kind of get oriented and then change it to habitat, for example. And let's look at cores. So now there's a sage grouse core area right here. And this kind of goes to my earlier point. Not all cores are, not everywhere within a core is good habitat. It's not all stable over time too. This is 40 years of sage grouse habitat change. If you look at Douglas County, the Conservation Reserve Program. If you look back in the 1980s, this area had no CRP. And these shifting patterns of CRP have really had a big impact in that area. So lots to explore here. I think I've given you a high-level overview of kind of the main functionality. I would like to go back to the slides here and just pose these questions again and briefly give you a little heads up around these questions. So the first one, right, into kind of narrowing down this decision space was, what is your target, right? The 2 ecosystems and the sage grouse. Those are your options. There might be more in the future. And if you think about where are the impacts occurring, I showed you for each of the species or ecosystems, you can look at habitat and connectivity. There's a human footprint model. There's these fractional rangeland cover models for invasive annual grasses. There's lots of base data layers that you can click on and off. And you can think about change and trend as ways to identify where those impacts are occurring. You probably, you all live and work in this landscape. You know where the impacts are locally. This is really to help you look regionally and see where the broad patterns of impacts are. So there's opportunities to use these data to look at impacts. I think we don't have a lot of, we don't project invasive annual grasses into the future, for example, or these different vegetation types or ecosystem distributions. But you can look at trends, right? Areas that have an alarming trend, and if you might be concerned that the trend will continue into the future or get worse, you might consider thinking about trends as a threat, as a way to think about threats. We are talking about including future projections, at least of climate change, into this portal as well. And so that would be looking at change and future climate could be also a future threat that you could map. And then if you think about what actions are available to you, this is all over the place, but really they kind of fall into, I think, 3 big buckets. You can restore habitat that's been degraded. You can protect habitat that's valuable right now. And you can mitigate barriers that are preventing movement or limiting movement between core habitat areas. And so the question becomes, where do I protect? Again, I think at these 2 scales, looking at a regional scale, what are the most important? I would focus protection in the core habitat area. It's the best of what's remaining. And maybe you might protect the largest and most central ones over maybe ones that are on the periphery if you had to choose where to invest your dollars. There's lots of perspectives. There's no right answer here. So it's hard to say what's, this is part of the exercise today is, how would you consider using these data sets to prioritize? This is just meant to to kind of start the conversation, get the juices flowing. For these growth opportunity areas, if you could grow the core, where would you grow the core? Should you focus on growing, the biggest bastion of the best habitat left in these areas, or should you focus more on creating a new large core area somewhere else? That's a key decision. It's the same with restoration. Again, you can focus on the biggest concentrations of habitat and try to restore, or you can focus on the periphery and try to expand the range. There's no right answer. There's just lots of trade-offs. I think the barrier mitigation question is the thing that we have the least amount of data for. We've mapped corridors. These purple areas are kind of the extents of those corridors, the full, I would say, footprint. But if you go into the monitoring data, you can, for each of the 3 targets, you can drill in and look at finer scale patterns of connectivity. I think for that, if you're interested in mitigating barriers, the biggest ones in the region that really we can do anything about are typically the highways. And so look at where these corridors cross highways. And then ask yourself the question of, well, which highways are probably posing the biggest barrier effect? I-90 Highway 2, the bigger highways, and what are the kind of the relative distribution of these cores across the landscape? Which barriers might be having the largest fragmentation effects, and that we should focus on. Again, I think there's a lot of things we can do to help drive decision making and focus it. But I think the data that we have right now available on corridors is a start, at least to orient you in this landscape. All right. Well, that was a whirlwind overview. I don't know, Sonia, if you want to allow some time for a quick question or two, or if we could just address the questions in the breakout groups too.
I think we have a minute or two. Let's see if there are any questions, and if not, if they come up in the breakout groups, we can address them there as well. Any questions for Andrew on what he just shared?
This is Matt Stevenson. I have a question for you, Andrew.
Sure.
And my apologies if I missed it, but within this tool, are you tracking the stewardship status by priority type?
No. Right. So the tool is really focused on the condition, the status of the landscape across time, but intersecting that status and the priorities with where we're investing conservation right now, or who the owner is, or the stewards of the land. I can see that being very useful. If there's interest in kind of intersecting, having functionality in this tool to intersect those, we could definitely add that to the extent that the data sets exist.
That would be excellent, at least for the purposes that I'm thinking of using this tool. And a related follow-up question is if the tool is able to track absolute loss or gain in the spatial extent of Shrubsteppe, regardless of quality.
Yeah, so that kind of gets back to this slide. So most of the information in the tool right now is showing you the status in any one year. And there's no functionality right now to say, well, what about the change over time over an extent of interest? Like your extent could be the whole region. Like how much Shrubsteppe is left and how much have we lost? It's those sorts of questions I think you're after. It's very doable. We anticipate folks wanting that, but it's, in version 1.0, it's not there.
Renee, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm using my boss's Zoom account. This is a Grant with the Walla Walla County Conservation District. I forgot I was logged into hers. We're trying to think of doing some upland restoration projects and things, which has been hard just because quite a bit of the money has been focused on salmon. But thinking ahead in the future and that sort of stuff, how sensitive or kind of what resolution would this pick up with restoration actions? I mean, if you restored like a field, would it pick up, or would you really kind of need to restore more on, hundreds of acres before you started to kind of see some differences in those metrics that you were mentioning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the products in here are based on Landsat imagery, which is natively at 30-meter resolution. So it's not going to detect anything very fine scale. But even at 30-meter resolution, these are models, right? And there's error when you zoom in to very fine scales. It's kind of hard to see with the imagery. It's not all imagery is, you can't see individual sagebrush, but that looks like so this is sagebrush cover in 2022. I think if you were to zoom in, if you could see, yeah, that looks to me like it is actually dense sagebrush there. And the model's kind of picking that up. So, so these are individual fields, right? So you can kind of get a sense of the scale. There's the error bar, that's half a kilometer. So it does start to break down at very fine scales. If you look at individual pixels, they might not be accurate. But if you look at the level of like on the scale of hundreds of meters and maybe, you know, these fields, that's, I think you could potentially get some valid insights there. They are models though, and really I think the sweet spot is really the intent of this whole initiative really is to not look, not start zoomed in like that. It's more to focus at the regional scale. What are the changing patterns over time and space, and where should our attention be in this landscape to keep this ecosystem functional and resilient? And you start to only get to that fine scale once you've considered the regional context. And that's really what these priorities are about. It's about thinking regionally. But you're right, at the end of the day, all conservation's locally, you got to get down to that local scale too.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, we've got Kaylee with a question, and then we'll move on to the breakout groups.
Hi, I think you may have actually just answered my question with giving Grant that answer, but what is the data informing the information for, you know, if you've got that sliding scale and you're going back to 1990, is that also based on Landsat data?
Yeah, yep. So at the, this might be useful too. If you go to monitor landscape Landsat imagery, and we can look at this false color composite shows like, kind of highlights the vegetation. And we can kind of zoom into an area and we can go back in time and just look at this changing landscape. So this is all annual summaries of Landsat imagery, and all the models of, you know, habitat and connectivity and range of fractional cover of sagebrush, they're all based on this imagery.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. Andrew, if you could go back to the slide deck for me. Yep, that next slide. And while I go over what we're going to do next, there's a question in the chat that maybe you can answer there, Andrew.
Oh, okay.
So what we're going to do now is actually break up into, it's actually going to be 5 groups. I don't know what I was thinking when I put the slide together. We're going to break out into 5 groups, and each group is going to be given a scenario. So we're going to ask you to place yourself in the shoes of a particular decision maker, and start playing around with the tool directly and think about how you would use this information to inform that decision that your scenario asks you to make. So in the spirit of what both Janet and Andrew have described about, you know, this is a first version of the tool, and there's lots of room for building on it from here on out. This exercise will hopefully do 2 things. One, give you some concrete experience going in and looking at the information that's in the tool and thinking about how you would use it to inform a specific decision. But it will also point out, oh, these are the things that the tool doesn't have, or data sets that are not there that I would use. And we want to hear about that as well. So there'll be a lot of sort of hopefully really good discussion and back and forth in doing that. Any questions on the process and how we will go about this activity before I break everybody out into groups? Janet, go ahead.
I don't have questions, but I'll share that like the point, maybe reiterating from early on, the point of this is to really get you kind of poking around and seeing what is in the tool, looking at, you know, the opacity toggle, looking at what all the suites of data are, and the monitor versus, I think, prioritize tabs. And when you're answering the questions in these scenarios, there is no right answer. We did this exercise as a group, and I think I was really intimidated because I didn't want to sound dumb. But like hearing other people kind of work through their thinking on how they got to an answer to help prioritize was really super informative and helpful. And so there's no right answer, but we are going to ask you all to kind of share your thinking with your group. Ideally, you would be able to share your screen, kind of walk the group through the thinking that got you to a decision. And then when we come back together, ideally we'll have a couple of volunteers, maybe one from each group, to kind of share with the larger audience here what the small groups talked about. So don't be intimidated.
Thank you, Janet. Okay, we are running a little behind schedule, so we will actually stay in the breakout groups. I'll say till 3:40, and then just have a very brief report out from the different groups when we come back. Okay, I'm opening up all the rooms. Very good. It looks like I think we have all the groups, and we did take a little bit longer on the breakouts. I will take full responsibility for that. But let's do just a very, very brief report out. So think, 2 to 3 minutes for each group of some of the highlights of what you discussed. And since I did get a volunteer in my group, I'm going to kick us off asking Mike to report out on our group. And then Janet will go to your group since it was the same scenario. Oh, and Mike, would you give a high-level overview of the scenario itself as well? Because other groups had different scenarios.
Could you show the slide, Sonia, maybe? While
I
he's
can
doing
show
that?
the slides if people want to see that.
Awesome, thank you.
So, and you can read on the slide and get it better than I can say it quickly, but basically it was looking at implementing a SAFE program at an eco-regional scale. What would you look at to prioritize that? What layers would you be tapping in Terra Adapt, so forth? And what other layers would you want to pull in that you maybe don't have in Terra Adapt? And in general, I think there was a couple different angles at it from our group. It was all looking at the prioritization map, be it from the Xeric or the Grouse or whichever prioritization map you'd want to use. A lot of ours was focused at the Xeric map because it was more generalized and could be applicable to a larger scale than sage grouse alone would be. And we had two different opinions, I guess. There was one side of us came at it that we should really focus at SAFE in the growth areas and the corridors, trying to connect and expand. And there were some of us also that were looking at it the other way, saying actually maybe it'd be better to focus that into the cores, given SAFE is a 10 to 15 year, and you might lose that habitat in 10 to 15 years, rather than creating some islands in the middle. You maybe could expand the core, strengthen the core for at least a shortened time period. But there was also good reasons to go to the expanding the growth areas of the priority. So we kind of came at it from both sides on that angle. Information to bring in that we don't have in Terra Adapt. A lot of that was focused around the agriculture, who's already enrolled in SAFE. If you could actually get to that type of information, who would be more inclined to maybe re-enroll in SAFE, that kind of angle. And then but the finer scale one was looking at implementing, reaching out to folks on sage grouse specifically in a more localized scale. And again, still with that angle that you're coming with them with FSA services, NRCS services, something in that local scale to help sage grouse in particular. I think again, that one from the Terra Adapt side, you'd be pulling the sage grouse priority prioritization layer, that cores, growth areas, and corridors. And then as far as other information to bring in, again, there's some of that question about agriculture, what type of agriculture is going on, and thus being able to maybe target it more towards those agricultural entities that be interested in working with us, not going after orchardists, because orchardists don't typically want to get into anything like this, but more targeting dryland farmers. And then also probably bringing in other data sets like our actual current sage grouse distributions and active flex, so that you can actually maybe you don't want to ignore the areas that aren't occupied, but you might want to give a little higher priority to those areas that are currently occupied. That's my quick sum up. If
Very
anybody
good.
from the group says I missed anything, please let me know.
Sonia, I'm happy to jump in now for
Go
group
for it.
2. Sure, we had the same scenario. And I think there were a lot of commonalities with the eco-regional scale. We talked about focusing in cores and growth areas in 2 ways. One, where there is a high probability of agriculture. So where could we actually target moving agriculture to habitat through enrollment in that program? And then a second perspective was kind of stack the habitat near where the species are. And so we talked about not just habitat suitability, but where are the last remaining strongholds of like birds on the ground, and targeting enrollment around them. And because of that, we did talk a little bit about other data that would be helpful, and some of that species specific like points or LECs would be helpful to look at. We also talked about land ownership and existing protected status. And I think that was both for the eco-regional and the fine scale. For the fine scale, I think that's where the land ownership is especially helpful, because sometimes we start with the landowner, the landowner interest who's interested in working with us. But we did talk about, let me see, looking at habitat suitability within core, adding in some fire data, including fire boundaries. I thought about the other data needed to help incentivize some of our existing programs, such as fence marking, and that's where we would need species location data. So I have a long list of the other data sets that would be helpful and things that the group noticed for functionality purposes. I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Let's shift to the fuels management scenario. Vincent, your group?
Yeah, our volunteer was Seth. Seth, you want to jump on?
Yeah, I can jump on. So we were looking at the xeric habitat priorities, and we were kind of deciding on whether to protect areas that we want to maintain so that a fire can't destroy a pristine habitat. But we were also talking about areas where it's degraded, and in order to get restoration back, we have to prevent those fires. And so that was a little bit of a mindset. And then looking at like the differences in where our shrub cover is versus our annual grasses, and trying to see that, hey, if a fire came through this area, it's going to burn hot and fast. With that, we kind of saw there was some gaps in data, specifically fire history. It's hard to know where our fires are going to occur without looking at the history. A lot of times our fires come through strategically on the landscape, the same place over and over and over. And so having a fire history on this would be really, really helpful. Also to see if maybe something's burned, 5 years ago, and that's why there's not sagebrush in there. It would help us decide maybe where our restoration could occur after our fuel management plans. And then the other thing we talked about was we looked at the human disturbance, and we thought maybe it needed to be at a finer scale, because there's a lot of outbuildings on these private lands that will need protected, and we can't really see that at this scale. Was there anything else, Vincent?
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job. I think we touched on some of those other data sets Janet and Mike also spoke about, was thinking about not just land cover, but sort of more fine understanding of land use and land ownership. So yeah, I think you covered most of it. So thanks, Seth.
Very good. Well, the third scenario was habitat restoration. Maybe Danielle, can we start with your group?
Yeah, we actually had so much discussion we didn't decide on a volunteer. So I am happy to take over. One of the other folks in the group, feel free to step up if you'd like. So when we looked at the eco-regional scale, some things that were brought up were focusing on areas that were near development, where expanding growth could end up either downgrading or kind of mucking up some of these core areas and growth areas. And also a lot of support for putting in like urban growth boundaries, understanding more of the social sort of landscapes that are happening out there. Trying to find a defending line was something that was brought up a couple of times. And sort of pairing different easement opportunities and also public land protections. So that was something that was interesting, and also looking at areas with good soils for restoration activities. And then when we looked specifically at Spokane County, a lot of the same sentiments were stated, looking at what's bisecting corridors for like the mesic habitat as well as the xeric, and focusing on uninterrupted areas as much as possible. One interesting point from one of the people in the group was about retired cattle ranches, and sort of focusing on areas in Spokane County that have this shift potentially in land use for potential acquisitions and things of that nature. So yeah, it was a pretty interesting discussion. I'll open up if anybody else wants to mention anything from this group. But we had a good discussion, so.
Very good. And last but not least, Andrew, your group. And then we'll just wrap up and hopefully get everybody out here pretty close to 4.
Yeah, Christine volunteered. Do you want to kick us off?
Yep, thanks. We had a good discussion about restoration and where to put funding towards that using the xeric ecosystems data layer. In summary, we really came up with a menu of strategies based on the need, and where each of us kind of focused on was really where we work. So that was a big gravitational pull to areas we know. So using the areas we know of to come up with answers to the question of where to put restoration in a strategic way. Some options we came up with were looking at areas where known habitat exists, such as leks or sage grouse, and then thinking about how to expand or protect the core in areas we already know about. And we could also choose a large public lands area with core, and then think about how to develop a program to help focus on areas that need restoration that have a percentage of invasive annual grass cover. And then we also talked about private landowners, and perhaps there's some with key parcels in or around the core that might be aging out of their ag use for their lands. And yeah, we just came up with a lot of good ideas based on thinking about how to strategically approach this. And then someone had an interesting comment about thinking about where maybe it's not as appropriate to convert ag land if it's really productive. So thinking about what's the value of the productivity of the ag land, and really weighing your decisions based on the need for the landscape. If you had to make a choice, maybe you'd choose among or between ag land to convert it back to or habitat if there was another parcel that was perhaps just as valuable, but not as productive and supportive of the local economy. So just really thinking about strategic approaches in all different ways.
Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. We have been taking notes and we'll get back to you all with any questions that we haven't been able to answer. So keep those coming in the chat for the last maybe minute or two as I hand it over to Janet to wrap up.
Can you advance the slide to 30? Yeah, 39. So I think we all learned through this that 2 hours was probably not enough. I think that we could have probably spent another 20 or 30 minutes in our small groups kind of poking through. But we've decided to give you the opportunity, if you have the time, to spend kind of poking around in the tool this week. We're offering, quote, office hours next Monday from 2 to 4. And you are more than welcome to call in and ask any questions that you have conversations with us. It's not a join us at 2 and stay for 2 hours. It's just come and go as you feel appropriate. You can also reach out to us with questions by email. You're going to see the emails of our team on the next slide when we get there. We are, as Sonia said, we've been taking notes. I'm keeping my notes in a notebook. We've heard a lot of good recommendations for additional data sets and improving functionality. So thank you for all of that. Keep that coming as you spend the next week kind of poking around. Next step with the steering committee is our team. We actually just had basically a jump off meeting last Wednesday, I think, to talk about what's the next step for working with TerraDapt. The training here specifically ends the contracted work that they did to develop the spatial priorities. It was through a grant with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we're going to be working with the steering committee to identify like what the next phase is, developing a new contract for future work with TerraDapt, hopefully to build out some of the functionality pieces, adding some of the data sets, maybe creating additional species models potentially. We're working with them to develop that scope. Andrew called this version 1.0, and we know that we can improve, and so we're going to be looking to do that. So I will leave it there. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get the recording on the web as quickly as possible. I will follow up with a link to that recording. And it came up in my small group that just having the data would be helpful. And Vincent can provide that. And so reach out to Vincent. He can provide a package of the data to you, and you can work with it in your own ARC Pro project to your heart's content. So do reach out if you have questions. And again, we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, everybody.
Ta-ta for now.
Bye, everybody.